Let me now turn to my panelists. I'll first turn to my left to Dr. Bengali and ask him the fundamental question. Which segments or groups in our society, in a sense, are on the wrong side of inequality, in the sense that they face discrimination, intolerance, exploitation, and so on? Could you please identify some of those groups which are in the bottom 20 quintile, in the bottom of the 20th quintile, last quintile? Could you then also identify to us the apex of the distribution, which is the top quintile? What are the characteristics, what are the principal features of the 20% top elite or families of Pakistan? Could you please help us in identifying the two ends of the income distribution, the lowest end and the highest end? So with this initial question to profile inequality, I turn over to Dr. Bengali.
A woman of great vision and great courage. I last met her at spent some time with her in Quetta in the Serena Hotel when I was serving Dr. Malik Baloch, sitting here in an advisory capacity. I was head of Dr. Malik had set up a sort of a development cell, which I was heading. And sitting in the lobby of the Serena Hotel, we had a couple of hours to talk. And she said that we have to start building an agenda of campaign for economic rights. That was my last extensive sitting with Asma. And I think it's very apt that in this session today, there are two sessions on the economy, now and then again later in the afternoon. When you said I have to identify which part of the population is on the wrong side of the fence, I was immediately going to say the rich and the powerful. But then you clarified what you meant by it. So let me say this. We have created two Pakistans, and it's very clear. It's visible also. There is a Pakistan which lives, as you rightly said, that looks like California. Palatial houses. If there are 4 people in the house, there are 5 bedrooms. On average, they have 2 cars per house. There are more than 2, but there are, let's say, 2. This is a class whose children have never ever sat in public transport. They don't know what it means to sit in public transport. They go to schools where the per child tuition is 3 times the salary of the chowkidar of that same school. They don't know what the other side is. I once had an occasion to, my nephew lives abroad, came here, and he went to primary school in Pakistan, so he checked up all his old friends, where they were. I used to live in PECHS, which is now a middle class area in Karachi. In the 50s and 60s, it was an upper class, but now it's middle class. And he found that all his friends who used to live in PCHs had moved to defense. So he used to go and meet his friends in defense. One day I couldn't pick him up, so I said, I'm busy, you ask somebody to drop me. And he said, no, none of them have the permission to cross the Clifton Bridge. You know, they can't go to the other side. This is the wrong side of Pakistan. They've never traveled in public transport. You know. Then there is the right side of Pakistan, the poor, the middle class. And the middle class is very small, so it's not really, you can't say much about them. And in the COVID situation, that has shrunk dramatically. Whatever little there was has already shrunk. You know, we personally know people, those who have been our colleagues in different organizations, are poverty-stricken now. They can't pay their rent. They have pulled their children out of school, and so on and so forth. They live in two-room houses, kachi-abadis. And in fact, our research, and I have had the privilege of working with Dr. Pasha for almost 20 years as colleagues in Karachi University and later also. Dr. Pasha was also my advisor for my PhD. We have done, in fact, it was Dr. Pasha who introduced me to urban economics and to housing and things like that. We have come across families where they live 20 to a room. And they say that we don't know what it means to sleep with our legs stretched out because there isn't enough space. You know, and we found this in Lahore also. You know, Punjab has very high economic indicators compared to the rest of the province. In how much time do I have?
You'll have to conclude in 2 minutes.
Okay, I'll just finish. There is a population below the poverty line, and then we talk of severity of poverty. How below the poverty line? How much below? Lahore we came across as the highest in terms of severity of poverty. There are poor people, but the very low below the poverty line we found in Lahore. And this is the glamour city now as you drive around. So I think this is what we have done. There is a Ashrafia, the elite, on the wrong side of the fence, and there is the mass of people, middle class, poor, living in slum houses, quarters, one-room houses, traveling on buses on top of bus, hanging out of windows, no schooling, no education. And I want to conclude by saying that this is deliberate. This is not accidental.
Now let me turn to one of the findings of the United Nations Development Program, Human Development Report for Pakistan for 2020, which did a long-term historical analysis of the trend in inequality in Pakistan. And found a fairly strong correlation between the nature of government and the trend in inequality. The conclusion that was reached, broadly speaking, was that generally authoritarian governments are accompanied by periods of rising inequality. And perhaps the most vivid manifestation in our history of rising inequality, which had profound implications for our country, was the so-called rapid growth in the Field Marshal Ayub Khan era, which led to the emergence of 22 families, and perhaps one of the reasons for the loss of the Eastern Wing. Then, of course, the Musharraf era. The other interesting correlation is that generally democratic regimes, despite perhaps their inability to mobilize the kind of growth momentum, nevertheless we have seen declines in inequality during these periods. And perhaps the best example of this, which has not been highlighted much in the literature but now by UNDP, is the decade of the 90s, where we had, for bulk of the period, democracy. And one of the breakthroughs in that period was agriculture and self-sufficiency in food. And that helped enormously in reducing poverty and inequality. We have never talked very much about that period, success in reducing inequality. So I'll turn now to Dr. Bengali, who's done a lot of research on the trends in inequality. Why is there this tendency that in our history, in the past 30 years of military government, we have seen rising inequality mostly? And perhaps the Ziaul Haq period is a slight exception. It remained somewhat low. And why is it that during democratic periods we have seen a fall in inequality? Is there some kind of a rational explanation for this?
There were so many pluses that we have during the 1990s. Yes. It was a politically chaotic period, chaos created from some corner of Rawalpindi, but it was certainly not a lost decade. Generally, what is highlighted is not the rise in inequality during authoritarian periods. What is highlighted is that the growth rate during authoritarian period is high and low during civilian period. So let's have authoritarian governments. But the fact is that in Zia's time, you know, there is a very good cartoon I saw. It was done by some Latin American radical groups, that there is this map of North and South America. There is a tree that grows in South America and its branches go in North America. The workers in South America are toiling, watering the tree, and then the North Americans are plucking the fruit. You know, this is exactly what happened. The 70s was a golden period of Pakistan's history. Again, it is beaten that nationalization hurt this economy. I have actually checked the numbers. My question to myself was almost 20, 25 years ago, or 30 years ago, was when Pakistan broke up in 71, we lost a war, there was massive damages. Why didn't the economy collapse? It didn't. 71, the country broke up. The fiscal year 72, 73, all numbers are looking good. Exports are going up, government revenue went up. So it was a conundrum that I was trying to answer. So my answer is that nationalization actually saved the economy. If there was no nationalization, these 22 families would have taken their money and run, and the country would have collapsed. But the fact that nationalization made sure that capital remains within the country saved the economy. Just one example I'll give you of this tree that I gave you. There were massive capital investments in the 70s under the Bhutto government. Port Qasim, heavy mechanical complex, heavy electrical complex, Indus Highway, chemical industry, the whole basis of the chemical industry was set up. Port Qasim. If you plot the industrial production from the CMI, Census of Manufacturing Industries, over a long period, you will see from the 60s to 1974 and onwards, there's a growing line, a very healthy growing line. But in 1982, there is a sudden jump up, and then it goes up again. Why this sudden up? Because the steel mill, which was construction started in 1974 under the civilian government, came into production in 1982 under the military government, and suddenly there was a burst of industrial output. That's what gives you high growth rates during military period of Zia. Musharraf time, it was all fudged. All the numbers are fraudulent. And I say this with full professional responsibility in my capacity, that all the numbers are fraudulent during the Musharraf period. So we don't believe anything. Now, why civilian periods give you better income inequality? Because the politicians who have to answer to the people They may be corrupt. They may be filling their pockets. But they also have to give something to the people. The generals who run this country don't even have contact with the people. I was in the first year of Musharraf's government, there was an ex-ISI chief who was railway minister. And he said that I am going to make railways profitable in 1 year. And his way of doing it was that remove all the Kachi Abadis on railway land, sell the land, and the railway will be profitable. You know? So they came, we got a call, I happened to be in Lahore that day. We got a call at 4 o'clock in the morning that the bulldozers have arrived. So all of us went there and stood in front of the bulldozers. I said, okay, first you have to bulldoze us before you. By the way, I'm also been on the streets, fighting, you know. I'm not just an economist doing with numbers. So we went there and we stood before the bulldozers and said, okay, first you bulldoze us before you bulldoze the houses. And the people around, now the MNA during the preceding Nawaz Sharif government was Tariq Aziz, the famous TV personality. He was no longer MNA. And the people around had gathered and had said, who to call? He said, call Tariq Aziz. Tariq Aziz is no longer MNA, he can't help us. Then, and who is in charge? And there was some Colonel something Salim or somebody. Anybody know Colonel Salim? Nobody knew Colonel Salim. So with politicians, you have access. I have seen Qaim Ali Shah, Chief Minister of Balochistan, people catching him by the collar and demanding, the Sindh Chief Minister. And I think the politicians have to get, you know, in Balochistan, Dr. Saab is sitting here, there is this accusation that whenever Balochistan gives money, it hires people and the money is spent in salaries. But what can any government in Balochistan do? Where can they give jobs from? There is no infrastructure to give jobs. The only thing they can do in the short run is to give jobs as peons in the government. Because people have to eat today. You can't tell people that this project is coming in 3 years, you will be well off. This is why we have better income distribution in civilian periods. And I think a friend of mine, Asad Saeed, Dr. Asad Saeed once said that corruption is across the board. In military periods, corruption is accumulative, and in civilian period, corruption is distributive.
The latest Household Integrated Economic Survey indicates that in the top 20% households in Pakistan, the average family size is 4.2. This includes the 2 adults. So they are very close now to 2 adults and 2 children, which is a kind of a very balanced family. But interestingly, and he's absolutely right, over the last few decades, we have seen the number in the lowest quintile households. Their family size now is 8.6. And they do tend to have 1 or 2 adult dependents also. So that means on the average, they could have as many as 5.5 to 6 children. And this is where the lack of emphasis on population control and planning in Pakistan, unlike our old brother country, today Bangladesh has one of the lowest population growth rates in the world of 1.4%. And we persist with almost 2.4%. Okay, the question now to Dr. Bengali, and the same question will be addressed also to Kardar Saab, is as follows. Please identify policies, changes in laws, and other institutional governance changes which you think can make a significant contribution to reducing inequality in our beloved country. Over to Dr. Bengali, and then followed by Kardar Saab.
So before I specifically answer this question, I want to comment on what Shahid has said. I can take issues with specifics examples, but I think on balance, I agree with what he has said. You know, the real divide in Pakistan, the structural divide is not between military and civilian. it is a class divide. The upper class, whether of the military or of the civilian, are aligned and united, and they follow similar policies. It's a horizontal thing. I had an occasion many years back. A friend of us died in a car accident. He was about in his late 30s, wife and 2 young children. He was in the military CMH in Rawalpindi for 41 days before he died. Trauma center, their trauma center. And I had taken the responsibility of night duty there because his family, he had no other family over there. And I came across rank discrimination between officers and non-officers in the military. So it's not just the civilians who are discriminated. Within the military, the lower ranks are discriminated against. If you look at the civilians, there is an alliance. There is an English, Pakistani, British economist who's recently done some work that the Gadi Nasheens of Sindh and Balochistan have ruled all along in whatever government comes. Then there is this new urban classes that have begun, especially the property classes, the land property builders, and a couple of them who have the stock market mafias that have emerged. They make enormous money, and all of them, some we know personally know their relationships with the military. So there is a class divide. Now the question, Pasha Sahab, what to do? Laws and policies is not going to change this, because the absolute control over the whole machinery making laws and policies, it with the very people who are benefiting from this rotten system. No, we have to fight. We have to fight on the streets. हल जो है वो बातों में नहीं है, बगावत में है. आए बगावत करें.